Good afternoon, friends. Welcome back to the conversation. I'm Mike, the Hermit of Loch Ear, to talk about the post-Christian world. I don't know what number in the series is. Today I'm going to do a little bit of a pivot into a new direction. So I want to go back and a little bit of review so you understand where I've been trying to go until this point. In case you're joining me brand new, the issue is that we were living in a post-Christian culture, society. In Europe, it's been 100 years, but America, just about 5 years ago, was the tipping point of when we went over to less people being Christians than are Christians, at least based on how they answer surveys. And I don't see this as a bad thing, because what people are rejecting is not the Jesus of Nazareth. Really, just today, I looked at Facebook, and I don't know why. There's a comedy page that posts jokes, and usually it's a lead into a joke. And today someone posted, "Why did most of you leave Christianity?" Isn't that bizarre on a comedy page? But I think they had well over 100 answers. And I went through and I think I read every one. And every single one was a rejection of something about the Christian culture. Not one person said, "Well, I read about the Jesus, and I read the Beatitudes and Sermon on the Mount and the way he behaved, and didn't like the guy. He was just nasty." No one said anything like that. It's all about the culture, and that's why I'm doing this. Is because I'm speaking to those people who've left Christianity or who contemplate it. Like I left Christianity in 1990, and I eventually came back to it after I discovered the historical Jesus. So I'm just saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the other thing I was trying to emphasize during the talk up until this point is how powerful culture is to dictate to us how to dress, how to think, how to behave. And it's an instinct that's buried deep in our brains that sometimes has no logical no logical conclusion. Why? I mean, the tie that men wears makes no sense. But in the business world, it's changing a little bit. In the business world, it was mandated that you wear a tie. It makes no sense, but that's what the culture said. So if you're someone who come to the conclusion that you really don't like Christian culture and you want to stick with Christ, but when you leave that Christian culture, you will have hell to pay. I'm serious. I left the evangelical church in the 90s. I lost almost all my friends, all of them. They saw me as a heretic because I wasn't part of that culture anymore. They would say it's dogma. It has nothing to do with the Bible, nothing to do with any dogma, anything like that. And when you leave a church, say if you're going to church now and you really don't like it, and you don't like it, and you're thinking about leaving Christianity, but you say, so I can hang on to Jesus and leave the church? And you try to leave the church, you will lose lots of friends. And it's always a moral issue with them that you've turned your back on God because you're not part of that culture. But this has nothing to do with the Bible. I am sorry, nothing. There's one little verse about, you should meet with other Christians now and then. That's it. And you can get into, what the Bible says about church structure and things like that. I won't go into that in this video because it's too complicated. In my book, which I'm not really pushing, Butterflies in the Belfry, I talk about that a little bit. What's the real meaning of that verses are used to beat people over the head that they got to be part of the Christian culture. Anyway, with that said, and going back to this thing I saw on Facebook today, why people have left the church, I want to talk about that a little bit. And then at the end of this, I'm going to deviate into, I thought it was going to be a very selfish thing of why I left the church, and it has to do with the issue of truth. But in this thing today I saw on Facebook, I bet most of them had issues of truth. They go to church and they hear things that aren't true. They know it's not true. I used the example of a young earth as just one thing, but there's many, many things. Now the conservative church is so deep in bed with conservative politics that they will pass on conservative politics, conspiracy theories and things that have no basis in truth. And they believe this, and that's part of their church now, all these conspiracy theories and all this crap. So people left the church because the church has lost its way in truth. So that's where I'm going to focus on going for the coming weeks. And I thought that was a selfish thing, again, until I saw this thing on Facebook and realized that's a big reason why a lot of people have left Christianity, is the issue of truth. What I would call epistemology of how do we get knowledge? How do we understand? How do we use reason? What is evidence? Those things. And I'm going to talk about that more and more. Just before today, what I'm going to do, the first step in going down that path, I'm going to talk about the history of philosophical thought in the West. And I see people's eyes gloss over when I say that. I offered again this year, I was trying to teach some Sunday school classes, and I offered that as a class. I could see the committee looking at me as just another dumb suggestion that Mike is making about. And I think they're right. If I was to teach, I could teach a 20-week class on how secular philosophies have shaped the Christianity going forward from actually for the last 2,000 years. But most people wouldn't care. And I mean, I guess I don't blame them. They're part of this culture that it's sort of a catch-22. They don't want to think about things because they're part of a Christian culture that says don't think about things. And I want to explain why that Christian culture tells you not to think. So you can see that vicious cycle. But before that, I do want to address one. A few years ago, it's now been about 10 years ago, I was very involved with post-Christian groups. There was a blog and a website by a very fine gentleman who's now deceased, Chaplain Mike, who he probably had hundreds of people that came there. And then I had my own called Christian Mononist. Excuse me, I've been battling a cold for 4 weeks. That's what cancer does to you. And that's why I'm a hermit, is because when I get out in public and I get sick, it lasts because I have cancer of the immune system, which makes me very vulnerable. But when I was in that group, and then I probably had 100 follows in my little blog and it was again postmodernism, not postmodernism, post-Christianity. That was a Freudian slip. That a theme that I heard over and over, and I don't know if it's a big majority of people who've left Christianity or it's those who are so hurt that they're the loudest, and they deserve to be the loudest. And I'm talking about those who are abused. Sexual abuse was a big one. And one of the more common abuses is in conservative evangelicalism. I saw this with my own eyes. As a matter of fact, this became a pivotal moment when I left evangelicalism, is that the man is put up as the absolute authority. There's this guy, Bill Gothard, I say more cultish like now, who preached this. He was never married, and he got in trouble for some sexual issues, but I won't go into that. But the male is put up as absolute authority in these conservative groups that I was in. And I felt very uncomfortable with that because I have a lot of empathy. I have empathy towards my wife and kids. And I think I mentioned the very last thing that my navigator supervisor told me, the one that almost got my son killed, he said, "Someday, Mike, you're going to have to lead your family." What he meant was, someday, Mike, you're going to have to abuse your family the way I abused my family. Exactly is what he meant. So there's a lot of, especially women who come out of these conservative areas that have been emotionally abused. Maybe not physically, not hit. There's some that have probably been hit. I know, I forgot where I was at with a conservative group. I think it was a homeschool group that I heard a man talking about spanking his wife. Really, that's true. But I want to talk just a minute about the sexual abuse. I'd mentioned in my church growing up, we had a sort of assistant pastor that was a pedophile. And evidence has shown that not only the Catholic Church, but the Baptist Church has been full of pedophiles. And the pedophiles have been hidden, like in our church. They didn't do anything about it. They knew about it. But I want to tell one story to illustrate this. And the reason I'm even telling this story, if there's someone out there who's been abused in this way, sexually or emotionally, is that I understand. I have empathy for you. I didn't leave the church because I was abused, and I've said that over and over. And going back, when you leave the church, I said this earlier, they will make it a moral problem, but they will also say, "Oh, you're leaving the church because someone offended you." And that wasn't it either. That's an excuse because they cannot recognize that their culture is not that good. Now, they think it's from God, And God established the church and this culture, and it's just the way God wanted it to be. It's not. It's really, really not. And again, there's good people in it. So they will say that, you've been offended and therefore left. But anyway, I had a friend, I haven't seen her in a little while. She grew up as a missionary kid in Africa, and it was really in the jungles of Africa, going back in, she's the same age as me, so probably as a kid, she was probably in the 60s and 70s. So her parents were ministering so far in the jungle that the way the mission is a very conservative mission board, the children had to live in the city, which was a couple of 100 miles away, and there they had a large school, and it was a residence school where the kids lived, and rather than dorms, they had these big houses, and each house had a minister and his wife and his family, and then all the kids that were staying there as they went to school. And she was telling the story when she was a young girl. I think she said she was really young, like age 10, that this pastor, Pastor Dave, would always come in the bedroom to the kids. His wife would do this, and he would do it, reading Bible stories to the children as they went to sleep. And around age 10, he started touching her in very uncomfortable ways, and it was a slippery slope gradually. And I can't remember the timeline, but at least by age 12, he was sexually molesting her, without a doubt, getting her to touch him and him touching her, and I can't remember how far it went. It may have gone all the way to rape. But it was at that point when she was 12 that it was a crisis in her life. And she spent 9-10 months of the year away from her parents. But in the summers, she would go to the jungle and actually live with her parents. And one time she went to the parents when she was home, and she's talking to her mother and said, "Mom, I need to talk about something that's going on." And she said, "What is it?" And said, "Pastor Dave has touched me under my underwear and got me to do that to him." Her mother, she said, had this look of shock on her face, and she didn't know which way this was going to go. She knew her family very well. And in that conservative Christian world, there's a game of piety. Who is the most pious? And you try to pretend that you have a perfect family and everything's perfect. Just a side example, I think more evangelical kids are spanked on Sunday than any other day of the week because they embarrass their parents in front of other evangelicals when they don't dress right, when they chew gum, when they might say a swear word. So they take their kids home and beat them because it embarrassed them, because there's this competition going on of who's the most pious. But anyway, so she didn't know how her family was going to react to the story. And a couple of days later, her mother and father called her into the bedroom and wanted to talk with her. And the father said, "Your mom told me about this story that you were saying about Pastor Dave." And she said, then they said, "We are very disturbed." And she was hoping that they're going to be disturbed for the right reason, but then they weren't. They said, "Don't you ever say something like that about Pastor Dave. He's a wonderful, godly man, and you will destroy his reputation. And you're just telling lies directly from Satan." Her heart broke into a billion pieces that day. And as soon as she could be emancipated from her parents, I think age 18, she came back to the States and left Christianity. And I don't think she hardly ever spoke to her parents again. But this is the kind of thing that's happened over and over. To me, from my experience in talking to people, it's not the major reason people left, but it's a reason. So coming back to, that's a painful story to tell. Coming back to an area I want to address is this area of truth. And when I say the word truth, I'm going to make it clear. I've been watching on TV or on YouTube a lot of discussions between, and I don't know why, it just interests me, on young earth creationists and anthropology. I really love anthropology and archaeology and geology and these things. But I won't go into details, but there's one site that's Banner, a young man in like a crusade for truth. But I sat and listened to his program, and it's full of lies. I mean, factual lies. And so it's just a paradox that he's marching under his banner of truth. But what truth means to most religious people is not truth, and I'll explain what truth is in a second. It's dogma. So when they talk about biblical truth, they're talking about dogma. And a lot of their so-called biblical truth has nothing to do with the Bible. It's all about culture. And that's the point I was going to try to make. When I talk about truth, I'm talking about the classical definition of truth of simply that which is consistent with reality. Is the sky blue or is it green? Do trees grow in the desert when there's no water? And just things that you can easily examine and come up with a conclusion. That's what I mean by truth. So I'm going to get into this. I'm really going to get into the weeds with it. I have to hold myself back because, like I said, I'm very interested in this whole concept. So I'm going to start with a 30,000-foot view of truth. We're in a crisis today, not just within Christianity, but within all Western culture. And I'm going to put it on, I'm trying to explain it on this cycle of how, the same way that people wear blue jeans and people speak a certain way, that there's these cycles in culture that go round and round and round. And I'm going to get into that in future talks, conversations. I wish I could hear you talking to me. But today I'm just going to do the big view, looking at history, and trying to explain this a little bit. So, like Time Magazine, I've mentioned this on my blog before, in 2016, declared it finally the year that truth died, completely died. You saw it in the political world, and it's only gotten worse. But people today don't think the same way they did 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300. The way people think is differently now. So there's been a general loss of truth. So I said in Christian meetings now, I create this spectrum. I have conservative Christians and liberal Christians. If I sit in a meeting with liberal Christians, there's no truth. There's no truth. All religions are the same. Did Jesus live? It doesn't matter. So because there's no truth. And it's a very postmodern way, which I'm going to explain in a minute. The conservative side are lost their sense of truth just as much. They're talking about conspiracy theories, usually with a political tint. Biden is running a mafia and he's doing a pedophile. You hear all this in the conservative Christian stuff, which has no basis. I'm not political. I could vote for, I've voted most of my life voting for Republicans. I could vote for Republicans easily as a Democrat, as long as they're a truthful, honest person, which I think is good for the country. So let me give this historical view, and I hope you can listen and make sense of this. What I'm going to tell you is factual. It's truthful. If you're someone who's a scholar in history or philosophy, you will say, I misled people because I was so simple. Because history is not simple. I could sit here and go on for hours and hours, involve hundreds of individuals, writers, philosophers, thinkers, religious people who've influenced the way we think over the ages, and you would just get lost in the weeds. So I'm not going to go into those details. I'm going to do a very broad 30,000-foot view. So I'm tying this in with the way I was talking about culture. Culture really dictates the way that we think. Now, there's some intrinsic, automatic ways that we think that has a lot to do with reason. That's always there. It's always been there. Back since Homo sapiens first began to walk, or even before that. I mean, animals use reason. I watch my dog use reason all the time. But then a lot of these ways of thinking are imposed on us by our culture. I want to go back in the modern era of humanity, going back to the Greeks. I like to start with Pythagoras. I really like Pythagoras. Pythagoras lived, when did he live? I'm trying to think. Around 500 BC, I believe. And Pythagoras, you know him for his Pythagorean theorem in algebra. Pythagoras observed that the universe is built on a scaffolding of mathematics. It's universal. And that music and logic, all these things are built on this mathematical scaffolding. And that was one of the things that brought me back to God after I became an atheist, is I studied mathematics. And I wasn't looking for God. I don't get off another tangent, but I taught 3 Sunday school classes this year, and I had negative feedback on all of my thinking. That's why I felt like I don't fit in church culture anymore. But I had one as a scientist talking about how he found God again through some mechanisms in science. I relate to that very much. And someone was saying, why did you present that class? We don't find God, God finds us. Anyway, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but Pythagoras saw mathematics in the cosmos, and I saw mathematics in the cosmos. And I'm going to get to this much further down the road. I'm going to talk about what I call the grand enigma of starting from scratch, looking at all possible answers to why we exist, God, no God, all these things. And mathematics is one of the things that is puzzling, that it's not a human-created concept. It is a concept that exists even if humans never existed. Mathematics existed. So Pythagoras saw this. And Plato, who came 100 years, 150 years later, really read a lot of Pythagorean thoughts and observations about the universe. Plato was really a fan of Socrates. That was his teacher, but he also was a fan of Pythagoras. But Plato went a step further because he said in mathematics, you can have the ideal, I-D-E-A-L, the perfect. But in reality that we live here, we can't create perfection. Now, I'm building a cottage here, and I try to get my measurements down within 1/16 of an inch of every board I cut. But even with that, there's some errors because 1/16 of an inch wasn't enough. Things didn't line up in places. And that's the way it is in the real world. On a computer, you can create the perfect house. But when you go and build the house, because a board might be bent just a little bit, or twisted just a little bit, or there could be a nail that when you drive it in, it moves the board a fraction of an inch. So you cannot build a perfect house. No matter how hard you try, you cannot. So Plato started looking at it and sort of like me sitting around thinking about these things all the time. And he decided, this reality here must not be it. This must be just an image, not the real thing, because somewhere else, in some other realm, and in those days, the model of the cosmos, the Earth was at the center, and there was these concentric spheres of different layers where the planets were, where the stars were, and on the outer layer was what Plato referred to as the ether sometimes, or well, you might say outer space. But pretend that outer space had nothing in it. Everything was inside those balls right around the Earth. So Plato said somewhere up in that ether, there's another realm that's perfect, where all the tables are exactly either they're square or, all the corners are square, all the legs are exactly the same length, or perfect rectangles, perfect circles. All these things exist in that world, but you cannot do that here in this world. And that's why he concluded with that. In his book, The Republic, if you've read it in high school or college, he has his famous allegory of the cave, where he describes this world here is a projection of the real world. So in the cave, you're looking at the back of the cave, you're chained, so you can't turn around, and you're seeing shadows on the wall of what's going on outside the cave. That's what Earth is, the shadows. But the real world is outside. Well, this was Plato's teaching. It was very popular at the time of the conception of the church. When Christ lived, it'd been around for 300 years. It was the dominant theory, almost. Aristotle came along after Plato and had a different view. He didn't agree with Plato in this area. He believed more that this world here was the reality. And Plato said, nah, the real reality is up there. But the church, well, not just the church, some of the Jewish sects and others identified with Plato that they liked this idea of another world apart from this world. And the early church adopted this. Now, not all, in the beginning, it wasn't all. There were people who opposed Platonic thinking. But by the time we get to the 4th century, and Augustine was a devoted Platonist is what I'm trying to say. And read his The City of God. I think there's at least 3 references in there where he's talking about Plato as a de facto Christian. And he saw Plato as being a Christian because by the 4th century, the church had already adopted Platonic thinking. That this world here, and this world includes our bodies, it includes our reason, and includes all these things of life, are insignificant compared to the spiritual world. And the church adopted that concept. Augustine of Hippo really promoted this idea, and it became woven into the theology of the church. And it wasn't long before the church, and as I said, the church has always been corrupt. All human institutions are corrupt. All of them are. And I think God just gives it just incredible freedom. Oh, if you want to go start a church, start a church. The Israelites wanted a king. God didn't want a king, but he let them get a king. So humans wanted a Christian institution after Constantine in 312 was so-called converted. He created this Christian system. So once the church started forming, once the church was established, it found great advantage in Platonic thinking. Now just think about this for a minute. So now the church is the most powerful thing in society. It's in bed with the king. They want absolute authority. Power and authority is addicting. They want it over all the people. So you tell the people, what you do every day, your work, your lives, your thinking, your reason, is insignificant. It means nothing. As a matter of fact, it's nasty. It's nasty. I won't go there. It's going to go off on a tangent. That's how bodily functions have taken on a nasty connotation, because everything our bodies do is nasty. And they try to pull verses out of the Bible to support that, but it's beyond what I'm going to talk about today. But the church is spiritual. We're up in this ether that Plato had described, another realm. So everything spiritual has great value. So the first person to turn me on to understanding history was Francis Schaeffer. He is regarded as the greatest Christian theologian of the 20th century. If I ever had a problem with hero worship, it was with Francis Schaeffer for a while. I don't think hero worship for anyone is very healthy, not for pastors, not for writers, not for athletes. And I hear a lot of Christians who just follow certain gurus that they put them up as heroes. So I probably did that with Francis Schaeffer. I ended up creating a job for myself at Mayo Clinic. That's where Francis Schaeffer had moved to. He died from leukemia. He was already dead, but his family was there. And his ministry called L'Abri was there. And I went and spent 5 years with them. I worked there at Mayo Clinic as a headache specialist, but I spent 5 years with them. So they were very, very helpful when I was trying to come back to Christianity. But they're not perfect. Francis Schaeffer, he made errors, but one of the first books I read of his was Escape from Reason. And some of them, he did a couple of movies, How Should We Then Live? And I forgot the name of the other one, where he goes into this history and he gets some of the issues wrong. So, but that just turned you on to this cycle in Western civilization. So the church adopted Plato, but Francis Schaeffer called it nature and grace. The ether was grace, and nature was earth, was our bodies, was our thinking, it was reason. And that was put down as negative. And it's not negative. God created the cosmos. He created reason. He created our bodies. He loves it. And I get so sick of people doing this. Even today, everything is spiritual. But anyway, this happened, and the church, it became a pandemic of thought throughout the Western civilization. It became the Dark Ages. Because when you say your art is no good unless it's a painting of God or Jesus, your work is no good, your thinking is no good, science is terrible. Because it's about cosmos. And the cosmos is really the devil's reign, is how the church saw it and how people saw it. And this is true today. I was saying, I taught a couple of classes on science, and I had 2 negative comments. That's the only comments I had about it, that you don't find God through science. And I've had this repetitive encounter for the last 30 years that dear, good Christian people want to tell me. They just can't control themselves. They just have to tell me, Mike, your faith is not authentic because you use reason. That is this crap that the church had adopted from Plato. Nothing to do with the Bible. Nothing. And it's still a pandemic today, even worse. So in the Middle Ages, this reached a peak. In Italy, however, the Medici family probably the wealthiest family that's ever lived. It's hard to measure the florin, the money of that day with dollars today. But the way they lived, if you look, their palaces are still all over Italy, especially in Florence. Just beautiful buildings and art. And they knew that society had a problem. Now the Muslims, who started in the 6th century, weren't part of this Platonic influence, not so much, a little. They were growing. That's where the science was. That's where people were living longer, better lives in the Islamic world, because they weren't seduced by this Platonic view. And I don't blame Plato. It was people who took Plato's ideas and then twisted them in order to have power, telling people, your lives are worthless. Only the church has value. Only the church has value. And send your money to the church. Send your devotion to the church. And it was a power grab. It was not I don't say it's a God thing at all. So the Medici family, Cosimo was the sort of the mafia, the godfather of this family. I was going to go into all these details, but I'm running out of time. It was him alone, plus his sons, that said, we got to change. We got to change what society is based on. And they were considering adopting Aristotle's teaching, which is more about reason, that this earth is real and solid and part of God's plan. But I won't go into those details. There's some things that happened that they became convinced that, no, the problem is not Plato. Let's keep Plato, but let's throw out the Christian thinking that the higher things aren't heavenly, and the church and the angels and God and spirituality. The higher things are humanity's emotions. That's what they decided. That's where there was the birth of humanism. And it was profoundly helpful to a point that there was this enormous awakening. We know it's the Renaissance, a beautiful art that had been pent up for 700, 800, 900 years, that was now been more than that, 11, 1200 years, and was now able to be expressed, and science exploded, and the misery of everyday life. People like to glorify the Middle Ages as a very good Christian time. People struggled to live to be 30, and they had this miserable lives, and don't let anybody tell you it's not true. It is true. It was true. And living became much, much better. And this was south of the Alps. Well, a couple hundred years later, the north of the Alps discovered Aristotle through an Islamic scholar who was living in Spain, one of the Moors. Ibn Rushd is his real name. Averroes, I think is what they call him in the Latin name. He was a scholar of Aristotle who believed this world was real. So they adopted, with the help of the Renaissance, breaking the authority of the church somewhat, Northern Europe adopted Aristotle. And that's where we started glorifying, in a good way, reason that God had given us. And this accumulated in the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, in my opinion, is the closest society ever got to nailing it right. I am a product, not a product, but I'm a vestige of the Enlightenment. It's where human reason is seen. You look at the writings of Newton and all the scientists of that time, they glorified God. God gave us reason. God created the real cosmos. It has value. He wants us to explore. It's like God created this playground, and we go out and explore it. And I've heard so many people tell me how science is wicked. Well, it's wicked because the church have been teaching us it was wicked for all these years. It's God stuff. Where do scientists come from? They get this mentality that science is the devil. And it's not. To me, it's one of the most perfect ways of worship. I went to a movie on James Webb Telescope in Seattle the other day, and it's just incredible. And it brings me to tears. And it shows me how big God is, more so than anything I ever heard in a church. Because it's not from the devil. God created this cosmos. And that's what is so frustrating. So that was the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment continued on. And then people, wrongly, this pendulum always swings back and forth, back and forth. So it swung to this irrational place of spirituality. Now it swung to the rational, or this was irrational, to the rational place of the Enlightenment. And then they said, wow, this is so successful. People are now living to 60 years old, and our lives are so much more comfortable, and we're fighting diseases, and we're learning about things, and our houses have heat, and going on and on. Let's keep going. And finally it went too far. It went to a thing of what some people call scientism, is the belief that science is our savior, will save everything. And I've said before, at least in my blog, the movie Oppenheimer really catches the end of that modernity. The scientism became modernity, modernism. Modernism was very popular all the way through until about the 60s, and it started to crumble. But in Oppenheimer, it showed the scientists wanted to understand the universe and discovered nuclear energy and nuclear fission, the atomic bomb. But it was the politicians. People say scientists have created all these awful things because they have no morals. Look at Oppenheimer, and that's the thing, the way it really happened. It was the scientists who had the morality. It was the politicians, and they don't talk about this in Oppenheimer, but often the religious people who want to drop nuclear bombs on people, not the scientists. Now, scientists certainly aren't perfect, but in that phase of the nuclear age, and it was things leading up to it, World War I, mustard gas was terrible, and all these things happening that people said, whoa, science is not the answer. So then ushered in the postmodernism age, and that was a response to science failing, but not science failing, humans failing in the way they use science. So in postmodernism, it says it turned its back on reason again. Reason has no value. There is no truth. And postmodernism started out in the 60s with a very positive way of deconstructing culture, just the way I've been doing it. But then it led that, the defining thing of postmodernism and philosophy is it has no overarching narrative. There is no true religion. So if you take Christianity, which says there is a personal God, Jesus is the Messiah, and you take Buddhism, which says there is no personal God, that suffering is brought about by want, and that we need to overcome the want, and we need to transcend this world. This world is just an imaginary world. And Christianity say, no, this world is a real world. And you say, you can combine them. They're both the same. Makes no sense. But that's the way that postmodern world that we live in, is that there's no truth. And people say, okay, well, it brings about peace, especially like in election 2016, there's a lot of anger, people fighting, people like me who can't stand Donald Trump, and people like my family and all my evangelical friends who think he's like probably better than Jesus Christ. They think he's perfect in every way. So there's this conflict and anger and all this going on. And so postmodernism is saying, okay, all opinions are the same. So Donald Trump is the greatest American who's ever lived. Every word out of his mouth is the truth. Donald Trump is one of the most evil Americans, and every word out of his mouth is a lie. Both of those are true. There's no opinions. We can celebrate. We can have peace. So it's very attractive because you get rid of all opinions. Everyone sings in a circle, hallelujah. But the problem is when you get rid of truth, next you have to get rid of all morals. So your neighbor is sexually abusing his children. Well, that's his opinion that it's good. Who am I to say that opinion is wrong? You understand what I mean? When you get rid of truth, you eventually can't speak against racism. You can't speak against cruelty. You can't speak against wars. You can't speak against abuse because there's no truth. And postmodernism, some of the philosophers think it's already turned a corner. And I'm not sure what it's going to be called or where it's going to go because it's failing. It's failing in the area of ethics. Okay, I've said too much today. That was just a broad view of Western civilization. And going forward, I'm going to talk about in a more in the weeds personal way of how we discover truth. Thanks for hearing me ramble today. You have a really good day.